Russian forces continue making significant gains along the first and second lines of defense within the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia regions. To the west of Tsury, the Russians managed to gain control over additional forest lines. To the southwest of the Danilivka, they are advancing along the Hulyaipole river line and the Yancho river line. To the south of this, the Russians continue offensive operations north of Hulyaipole, making significant gains in the direction of Dobropilya and the settlements along the Hulyaipole river along the second line of defense. These advances are both in the direction of the highway connecting to Hulyaipole further south and towards Hulyaipole itself, where the Russians continue their advances following the capture of Zatisha. Starting out in the northeastern flank of Hulyaipole, the Russians gain control over additional fortifications and the forest patch here southwest of Zatisha along the farm area just north of Hulyaipole. The Russians are aligning the front line with the river line further north along Zatisha before pushing down towards the city itself. The Russians are now mainly advancing from the eastern flank following the capture of the fortifications to flank the remaining fortifications on the northern outskirts of Hulyaipole by advancing through the residential area with the entry from the eastern flank, and at the same time they've aligned the front line with the river line just north, where they're advancing in the western direction rather than to the southern direction to gain control over the settlements along the highway in the northern flank, where the Russians will be gaining control over the settlements before advancing down towards Hulyaipole from the northwestern direction and attacking the fortifications from the eastern flank to combine their forces and gain control of the fortifications to gain control of the road entering Hulyaipole from the northeast. This will allow the Russians to attack the city from 3 different directions on the northern flank. Combined with the recent efforts on the eastern flank, the Russians continue attacking the fortifications to gain control over everything located on the outskirts of the city. Deep State Map spoke about Hulyaipole and mentions how Hulyaipole was almost lost before the battle even begun, and that is because the Ukrainians did not have enough forces. They took too many casualties withdrawing from the Yancho River and fighting along the first and second lines of defense. The 102nd Territorial Defense Brigade, which was the main one holding the Yancho River line defenses, the Russian forces were able to break through their defensive lines and outflank them, almost encircling the entire brigade. The command of one of the battalions in the 102nd Brigade was lost, and this led to the battalion almost being wiped out. However, the Ukrainians sent additional forces from the 225th Separate Assault Battalion and one of the mechanized brigades to the city to create a new defensive line and establish connection with the territorial defense forces withdrawing from the Yancho River. However, this also led to some friendly fire cases on the Ukrainian side that happened due to the withdrawing Ukrainians being out of command and out of communication with the forces on the Ukrainian side. So the territorial defense was almost encircled, and during the withdrawal, which really turns out to be a route from the Yancho River all the way to Hulyaipole, they ended up getting shot by some of the Ukrainian reinforcements arriving before a new defensive line was established. This, of course, was not a large-scale friendly fire situation, but on a smaller scale, but this shows the complete rout and the complete chaos of the Ukrainian forces defending this direction. And this is what allowed the Russians to make such significant gains over such a small period of time. The Ukrainians simply does not have enough manpower, and whatever they could scramble to help, the communication and the coordination between the two groups did not go well either, until they finally establish a common command along the outskirts of the city. But even then, the Russians were able to pull on their momentum and push through, gain control over the first line of defense east of Hulyaipole, and now enter into the city from the southeast and northeast. At the same time as the Russians advance along the second line of defense, fighting continues along the fortifications south of Vyderatne and along the defensive line near Danilivka. To the northeast of this, the Russians secured additional positions along the Vovcha river line, where they're looking to gain full control of it to secure the northern flank of Vyderatne and push upwards towards Pokrosk along the highway itself. To the northeast of this, the Ukrainians counterattacked in the direction of Ivanivka, regaining a foothold within the western outskirts of the town, as we see with this geolocated footage confirming the Ukrainian vehicles storming the town and the Russian artillery and drones on the defense. To the northwest of Pokrosk, the Russians started storming Hreshene, gaining a foothold in the eastern residential area, pushing up along the 00525 road and getting a foothold in the eastern parts of Hreshene The Russians are here working on getting control of the fortifications on the eastern flank, establishing a foothold and outflanking the fortifications of the Ukrainians on the northern outskirts of Pokrosk to gain control over these fortifications and the eastern road leading into Hryshina from the Rodinsk direction. With the capture of the highway connecting Pokrosk and Rodinsk, the Russians have a proper supply to the northern and southern flanks of Hryshina, both from the eastern and western directions, where the Russians are working on outflanking Hryshina from the western direction and fighting over the fortifications on the eastern direction to gain control over the roads leading into the town from the city itself and from both flanks. The Russians also continue offensive operations within Minat, where they manage to gain control over some additional streets and forest areas within the eastern parts of the city, as they continue offensive operations to connect their forces between the northern and western highways here along the eastern parts to the western parts to connect in the center. At the same time, fighting continues along the apartment complex area, the southern apartment complex area, and the northwestern parts along the farm area, and in the direction of Svitle, as well as the northern flank. Or basically, from everywhere. To the north of Minat, the Russians managed to regain control over some forest lines here to the south of Ivanivka and Novoshakhove, where they are developing defensive operations in the northern flank. Following the Ukrainian counterattacks in the area, the Russians have regained the initiative following the capture of Shakhove, where they are now developing offensive operations towards Sofiivka further northeast, to the northwest of Shakhove along the quarries, and now in the direction of Novoshakhove and in Ivanivka as well. The Russians here, with the capture of Volodymyrivka and Shakhove, have additional supply routes leading into the northern flank of Minat. This strengthens the Russian positions in the area, and they now have the advantage over the Ukrainians, where the fighting is taking place along Satyshuk and Sokhetsky in the south, Novoshakhove and Ivanivka in the west, and Shakhove in the north. As for the Sofiivka direction, the Russians are reaching the southern outskirts of the town as well as the eastern ones, where they're looking to gain control of the eastern flank as well as gain a foothold in the southern flank to push through along the Seny-Turets river line, cutting it off from Turetsk before pushing up further north along the river line itself. Further northeast on the western flank of Solidar, the Russians managed to gain full control over Vasyukivka, the fortifications along the farm area, and the town itself. The Russians continued offensive operations on both flanks of the defensive line along the river line to the south of Vasyukivka and along the settlements here on the southern flank of Siversk. Following the capture of the settlements all the way south of Siversk along the river line, the Russians have secured the eastern flank, and they are now able to concentrate their forces in the western direction, where they will look to gain control over one defensive section after another, separating them into different portions, and then gain control over one of them after another, while advancing along the open fields and the settlements leading further northwest in the direction of Vandarine, Nikoforivka, and so on, where they look to gain control over everything east of the canal here along the Tversk-Donetsk canal connected to the river line further north and the eastern flank of Slavyansk. The Russians are here looking to gain full control over Siversk and everything south of the Tversk-Donetsk river line and east of the canal. This will allow the Russians to stabilize this section of the front line and begin the siege of the Slavyansk-Sentinivka line from the eastern direction. Gaining control over this section, as well as the Liman section in the north, as well as the Pokrosk and Minat direction in the southwest, the Russians will be able to develop offensive operations towards the final supply lines leading into Slavyansk-Sentinivka line for a complete encirclement of it, while advancing along the canal and aligning the front line with the canal to the east will allow them to have the high ground overlooking the cities for their strikes towards them, and making the siege of these areas very difficult and costly for the Ukrainians. To the north of this, the Ukrainians continue their counterattacks in the vicinity of Kupiansk, where they now manage to regain control over the forest patch area here northwest of Radkivka, push up to the first line to the north of the settlement, and gain a foothold in the southern flank of Kindrashivka, getting control over parts of the forest patch area and other sectors along the south of Kindrashivka, where they're looking to storm the supply lines leading into the western parts of Kupiansk from the north. They're making use of the exact same tactic they used on the northern flank of Pokrosk and Minat, where they were looking to cut off the Russian flank in the north, which was used to cut off the supplies to Pokrovsk and Minat by attacking the flank and regaining control over the northern flank, which includes Kucherev Yar, Vilne, Novoshakhove, Ivanivka, Droshne, Nikonorivka, Satyshuk, Sokhetsky, and so on. A lot of settlements the Russians captured earlier were lost during this Ukrainian counterattack, where their aim was to cut off the supplies to Rodinsk and storm Rodinsk itself, gain control of which would free up the supplies coming into Minat and Pokrosk from the north. However, the counterattack dragged on. The Russians managed to gain full control over Pokrovsk, connect their forces between Rodinsk in the north and Pokrovsk in the south, gain control over the Demirivka and Shakhove, and now regain control over the northern flank of Rodinsk and counterattack in the direction of Rodinsk itself, gain control of additional roads leading into Mirnarad and Pokrovsk. This all allowed them to negate the Ukrainian counterattack, secure their positions, and hold on to the encirclement of the Ukrainian forces within Mirnarad, leading to a complete encirclement of what remains of their forces in the area. Now, the Ukrainians are pulling off the exact same idea in the Kupiansk direction. However, so far, despite weeks, if not months, of counterattacks by the Ukrainians, the Russians still have supply lines leading into the area, and they have gained control over the northern railway leading into the eastern parts of Kupiansk, from where they can supply their forces within Kupiansk itself. This means the Russians have gained whatever supply lines that they have lost elsewhere. If this continues for much longer, the Russians will be able to press on with their advantage with the semi-encirclement of Ukrainian forces here on the eastern bank of the Usk River line, where they can continue putting pressure on the Ukrainian forces on the eastern bank of the river line and eventually gain control of it. However, the Ukrainians have a better position in the Kupiansk direction compared to the northern flank of Minarad, where the Russians do have control over the river line. However, their supply lines going into Kupiansk is very limited for the Russian side, and they are not expending any massive efforts on the eastern bank of the Usk River line to gain control over what remains under Ukrainian control on the eastern bank of it in the Kupiansk section. The fighting continues within Kupiansk itself, where the Russians are likely looking to gain full control over the city before moving on downwards along the river line. And if they're able to gain full control over the eastern parts of Kupiansk, then the supply situation in the western parts has been fully secured as well. So the Russian objective is to continue advancing on the eastern parts, while the Ukrainians continue counterattacking in the western parts. And that is the balance of power in this section right now, and the objectives of both sides. The northern flank in the direction of Vovchansk, the Russians gain control over much of Liman and the forest patch areas, where the Russians are slowly pushing on along the western flank of Vovchansk along the forest patch areas, where they continue offensive operations down along the Tsury river line, where I've previously stated that a full capture of this river line would put immense pressure on Ukrainian forces operating here along the border area, the northwest of Kupiansk, and the general section of this front line, as the Russians would put the entire area in a semi-encirclement with Kupiansk in the east and the Tsury river line in the west. And that's going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.